Ah, Smart Water, now in a sleek can.
This feels cool, literally.
Perfect for social gatherings and on the go.
Should I start wearing turtlenecks?
One sip at a time, friend. Smart Water cans, for those with a taste for taste. Get yours today.
Today on CityCast Boise. In a surprising development, Idaho Democrats have out-fundraised Republicans by more than 4-1. We're digging into what the money really gets them in a state where they're still losing seats, plus how one lawmaker with a legacy name is trying to reinvent the party from the inside. It's Monday, June 16th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me today is Sarah Cutler, a reporter at the Idaho Statesman. Thanks so much for being here today, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
We know the mountain that Idaho Democrats have to climb is steep, but your recent reporting shows that they're pulling in more money than ever and even outpacing Republicans for the first time in years. What's driving that shift?
Yeah, this was a data point that I found really surprising, that in such a deep red state where typically Democrats, by and large, don't win seats, that they are outraising the Idaho Republican Party in 2024 by a factor of 4-1, basically. And that's a trend that's been ongoing since, I think, starting in about 2017 or 2018. And from the party's perspective, they think that it is a response to policies on the national level from the Republican Party, as well as actions taken by the Idaho state legislature. So from Idaho Democrats' perspective, this is a rejection, I guess you could say, of some of those policies and an enthusiasm for an alternative.
And it's not just the total amount of donations that stands out. Democrats also had significantly more individual donors than Republicans. Could this suggest that maybe the political identity is shifting slightly, or are we just seeing a backlash to, national issues or extreme policy making?
It's a great question, and it's actually something that's hard to interpret. I spoke with Boise State political science professor Jacqueline Kettler, who pointed out a wide range of possible interpretations here. Some of it is about potentially parties' different strategies and approaches, whether the party itself is soliciting donations or whether it really encourages its individual candidates to seek out donations, directly for their campaigns. And similarly, I believe the Idaho Republican Party has a dues structure where its local chapters send in contributions, whereas the Idaho Democrats typically, centrally collect funds and are sending money out to more rural offices. So some of what you're seeing there may just be, donations coming from a local chapter of the Idaho Republican Party don't count as an individual donation. So I think that the Democrats' response to that would be, to your question, yes, we're seeing a lot of individual enthusiasm. Unfortunately, the Idaho Republican Party declined to comment for this story on how it interprets these numbers, but I think there are some possible different interpretations of what this means.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into that. Even though they didn't respond, what was your read on potentially why their fundraising is stagnant? Is it that they just feel safe here?
It's hard to know for sure, and some of those, explanations from Professor Kettler certainly resonated with me. But it did strike me that, of course, if you look ultimately at the electoral results, whatever they're doing, the Republican Party is doing seems to be working pretty well for them. So it may be that there's not as much of a sense of urgency from their donors or from their voters that, yes, they feel safe here. But it is hard to say for sure whether, what exactly is driving that.
So how are the Democrats, with all of this extra fundraising, how are they spending this money? Is it going towards staff, ads, rural outreach, recruitment? Where are they spending this money?
Yeah, so I think ahead of the 2024 election, starting in about, I want to say 2023, the Democratic Party had announced that it was trying to focus more on rural outreach and building up its party infrastructure in rural parts of the state. A lot of that focus was on the idea that, for many years, lots of districts were going unchallenged. There was only a Republican candidate on the ballot, and the Democratic Party wanted to change that. So they told me that this year they're using this additional funding to kind of double down on those efforts. In the last 2024 election, they did manage to challenge at least every legislative seat in the state, which was a big achievement for them on that front. And they're hoping to double down. I think there had been what they called, I believe, dark counties, where there was no local Democratic office previously, and they managed to stand those up, and now they're trying to increase the training and the resources for those offices. So I would say they're kind of doubling down on rural outreach in in rural parts of the state.
That was a big achievement in mobilization from their party's perspective. But they still lost seats and ended up with what I would say is one of the most far-right legislatures in Idaho's history. So how are party leaders explaining that disconnect with all of this fundraising that's happening, having a candidate in every district, but then also still losing seats?
I had the same question for them. And so I should say first, Professor Kettler at BSU did highlight that concern. Not that it's necessarily happening, but that there's certainly a risk that, if you are able to raise all these funds, but the results don't show up in electoral results, you risk, alienating those donors in the future. And I think from their perspective, this is more of a long game. They acknowledge this is a deep red state. We're not going to win in every district, right off the bat. But I think they felt that it was still fruitful to keep going on this path. The other point they did make is that, I don't know if I would say they were reframing success or just that this is how they frame success, is that it's not only about winning seats, but that it can also be about reframing the conversation during campaigns. I think it was party chair Lauren Necochea who said, we've seen the result of candidates who are only looking over their shoulder to the right. The only competition is further more extreme potentially on the right than the candidate. And so I think their hope is that by simply having a Democrat in some of these races, they can bring up other points and just change the conversation, which even if ultimately a Republican does win, it may affect the approach that they take when in office. So I think the party also has kind of a broader definition of what success could look like.
When you spoke to the Democrats, did they say that they were tracking any other data like voter turnout, volunteer growth, local engagement that would potentially indicate these rural races are having an impact, even if they aren't winning elections?
They talked in general about how incredibly activated they felt their base was in Idaho this year. They made the point, as you would expect, typically as an election gets closer, people become more active in terms of donations, attending political events, whatever it may be. But they highlighted that even though we're, a year and a half out from the 2026 election, they're seeing pretty unprecedented levels of that engagement even now. I don't know that they're seeing it uniformly across the state, but I think, they said that they've got 2,000 people interested in running for office, which they see, is a big uptick. And I think they see it as a result of some of their efforts to increase that infrastructure around the state. And one example that they did give, I can't remember which candidate or which district this was, but they did give an example of changing the conversation a little bit with, in the 2024 election, the Democratic candidate highlighted the problems around Idaho's abortion ban. And now, once in office, the Republican who actually did win did try to make some changes to that policy. So I think, kind of changed the conversation and changed the approach of the Republican who made it into office.
With this idea of maybe changing their metrics or changing their perspective on what success could look like or what victory could look like, are there lessons the Democratic Party learned from their 2024 losses? And even though they're doubling down with this strategy, are they adjusting how they're going to run political campaigns in 2026 and beyond?
Great question. I asked that and I don't know that I got a totally clear answer. What I think I heard from them was they feel that a lot of the work is almost the persuasion is done for them because of what the approach the Idaho legislature has taken, some of these policies at the federal level. They feel that has been bad press for the Republicans and that, from their perspective, it will sort of naturally send people to them. The other piece that they mentioned was that they felt that they took a hit in 2024 because of the national ticket. So that means a lack of enthusiasm for President Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, trickled down to Idaho, and that a lot of people pay more attention to the national election and then sort of just vote all the way straight down a ticket, Republican or Democrat. So I think they felt that, I believe they said that they did actually outperform the Democrats at the national level, but even so, they felt that a lot of the blame maybe didn't lie with their efforts here in Idaho, but was more reflective of the national election.
So are they hopeful that with how political tensions are rising nationally and with how political discussions are going nationally, that they could potentially see more success in the midterms in the 2026 elections?
Yeah, I think that the Democratic chair, Lauren Necochea, used the phrase pendulum swing a couple of times. This idea that people were unhappy with the incumbent President Biden and voted Republican, and that they may already be feeling, from her perspective, some remorse and may therefore be more likely to go back the other way in this next election. And I think she highlighted as well in 2018, the last midterm election under President Trump, that was like the best fundraising year that Idaho Democrats had ever had. So I think she felt that setting, I guess, provides them with some advantages.
Hank's the family fixer, always with his tool belt. But living with prostate cancer, he needed help. He asked his doctor about Xtandi and enzalutamide. Xtandi 40 milligram tablets treats men with prostate cancer that has spread to other parts of the body and responds to a medical or surgical treatment to lower testosterone. Xtandi may cause serious side effects: seizure, a brain condition called PRESS, allergic reactions, heart disease that can lead to death, falls and bone fractures, swallowing problems, or choking that can lead to death. Stop Xtandi and get medical help at once if your face, tongue, lip, or throat start swelling. Tell your doctor at once if you faint, have a seizure, quickly worsening headache, decreased alertness, confusion, vision problems, chest pain or discomfort, or shortness of breath. Xtandi can cause harm to an unborn baby or miscarriage. Use birth control during and 3 months after Xtandi. Common side effects include muscle and joint pain, feeling unusually tired, hot flashes, constipation, less appetite, diarrhea, high blood pressure, bleeding, falls, fractures, and headache. Talk to your doctor and visit Xtandi.com.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at Ollie.com. Ollie! These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Sarah, I also want to pivot from Democratic fundraising to this idea of local politics, because you also wrote a story with a deep sense of legacy about Representative Monica Church, who's the granddaughter of 2 Idaho political giants, Cecil Andrus and Frank Church. What were you hoping to learn by talking with her?
We thought that she would be a really interesting vehicle to show the evolution of the Democratic Party in Idaho, given that both of her grandparents were such prominent Democratic leaders in the state decades ago, between, I want to say, the 1950s and the 1990s, between them. We thought that looking at her experience now that she is a state representative would kind of be illustrative. How does she reflect on her role, how she can make a change, make a difference in office, compared with the lessons or the legacy, I guess, she had heard, from her family. So we were hoping to kind of get a picture of the status of the Democratic Party.
And she had indicated that potentially she might run as an independent, which, given her pedigree with 2 very prominent Democratic grandparents, seems like an interesting shift. Did she talk about that, or why she potentially wanted to run as an independent?
That was something that was pretty striking to us. I mean, I think we went into the conversation expecting it to be really about the Democratic Party and her potentially attachment there. But I think that was one of the biggest themes that came out of the interview, was a sense that what she sees, bigger problems and bigger changes in Idaho's political system as a whole, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, because she sees that, from her perspective, the state's leaders across the board are much more beholden to whatever party they are a part of, and much less willing to display leadership, make choices that kind of go against the grain, and speak to voters about why they made those choices. So I think I didn't speak to her about, how seriously she had considered running as an independent, but throughout the interview, I think that theme kept coming up, that she was not interested in just following the party line. And she didn't feel that her grandparents had done so when they were in office.
You wrote that Monica Church doesn't see the Democratic Party's platform as a problem, but rather how it's presented or performed. And that feels like a bold take from a junior legislator. Did it come off as a critique of current party leadership, or maybe more of a generational shift in tone and style?
Good question. I didn't get a sense that it was a critique of party leadership, more potentially a critique of her fellow lawmakers, again, across the board, not just Democrats. But I think there was definitely a sense of people are not being as bold as they used to be. As leaders, they're not demonstrating leadership in terms of taking maybe personal risk, you could say, or political risk, to express what they genuinely think or vote vote in a way that may be unpopular, but do it because they think it's right. And she did acknowledge that, there may be some increased incentives against doing that, whether that's, harassment online, for example, or, just maybe, that being one a good example. But I think she still was expressing frustration with just that as a cultural change, across the aisle.
It seems like she's potentially interested in nuance in our political environment that really seems to reward absolutism. Did you get the sense that there's an appetite for that among voters, or is she potentially using her grandparents' playbook that was more effective in the 60s and 70s and 80s?
I can say that she acknowledged, it may be too soon to say, this was, her first term, her first session, and I think she was open to the idea that time will tell a little bit how effective of an approach this is in terms of working with fellow lawmakers and what she's able to get done. I certainly can't say how representative this is, but I was surprised to see that in terms of the responses we got to our story, just in the comments or, on social media, people seemed pretty vocally supportive of this and described it as a breath of fresh air. I wasn't sure what kind of a reaction it would get, but people seemed to feel that this was something missing in Idaho politics. Again, can't say how representative that is, but...
And she talked a lot about authenticity. Now, that's a word that gets thrown around a lot in politics. What did she actually mean by it? And how does she feel that she's authentically presenting herself at the Capitol?
I think that she did not just mean that in a political way. That was certainly part of it. But I think from her perspective, it is critical for lawmakers to get to know one another personally and to get to know constituents on a personal level and connect as humans before, trying to change minds or persuade. And so she both formally and informally in our interview talked a lot about personal attributes of other lawmakers. That was something that struck me. I think right when she showed up to the interview, she was wearing bright yellow sneakers, and I mentioned that I liked them. And she said that she and Representative Ehart, who's a Republican, both love to wear brightly colored sneakers. And that kind of anecdote came up a lot, where I got the sense that there had been some amount of time spent getting to know people and forming connections that weren't inherently political. And she made the point, too, it seemed like there was some humility there, that it has to also go both ways. It's not, if you are seeking only to change someone else's mind, that may come through and not be effective. Whereas if you are also open to having your perspectives changed, it becomes more of a two-way street. And so, a lot of our conversation, or a part of our conversation, was about her relationship with Representative Clint Hostetler, also a Republican, and the fact that they've actually formed a pretty close friendship and were taking meetings together, even though they have pretty opposing views, for example, on school choice, tax credits, school vouchers, whatever you call that issue. But they were sort of finding some common ground and starting, I think, with that authentic personal relationship and then going from there into the political issues. But again, she was openly saying that time will tell, I think, how well this approach works.
And did she say when building these connections or trying to get to know people on a personal level, that was having any impact on votes, on how legislation is being passed? Because Representative Hostetler really pushed the voucher bill, and Representative Church used to be a public school educator. But how are they squaring that?
It sort of goes back to some of our previous points about the Idaho Democratic Party viewing some of these things as a long game, acknowledging we may not win this seat today, but can we change the conversation? I got the sense that Representative Church may have a similar hope that, she may not change a mind on a given bill on a particular day, but is it part of a longer conversation? And I should mention as well, one of the days that we were interviewing, she had just gotten a call, basically a request from the education department to help put together a curriculum for a potentially required Western civilization course. And it would be, I believe, Representative Church working with somebody from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which of course is quite right-leaning. But she seemed pretty excited about the potential of having these, very different entities and agendas in a room together and seeing what they could produce. So that's not, directly in a legislative context, but I think is an example of the types of things she seems to be hopeful she can do, is just getting unusual people in a room together.
I definitely want to jump into that, because that stood out to me in your article as well, that Monica Church is helping develop curriculum with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And they're a far-right policy advocacy group that has been openly hostile to public education. And there's been Republicans on this show that I've interviewed that have criticized them for being extremist. Did she talk at all about how she squares that partnership with her values as a public school educator and as a Democrat?
We didn't get too deeply into it, but I think that she was optimistic about what could happen if they were actually in the room together and not just talking past each other. I think she was also excited to be asked because it sounds like it was not a given that somebody who, had taught these subjects in public school would be part of the conversation. I don't think we talked specifically about what she thought the parameters might be of what she could achieve in this setting, but I think simply being in the room felt like a step that they, these very different groups would, and interests would kind of be hashing this out together in real time.
And Sarah, one last thought. After your conversation with Monica Church and then discussions with the Democratic Party more at large, do you feel like her perspective is an outlier or maybe part of a larger realignment inside of the Idaho Democratic Party?
It's hard to say. From the sum total of people that I've talked to, I would say it's probably an outlier. I certainly can't say she's the only one, and I think it's a matter of degrees. When I sit in on legislative, public hearings, I do hear Idaho Democrats using a lot of language that might appeal more to Republicans, for example, focusing a lot on the issues of local control and things like that, rather than invoking terms you might expect Democrats to use in other states. So I think it's probably along a spectrum, but she probably voiced the most willingness of anyone I've spoken to, partner with unusual or unexpected people and take the heat for it.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I think this was a very fascinating conversation and look into the inner workings of the Democratic Party, their goals, their future, and specific candidates. Thank you for taking the time to break it down with me.
Thanks very much for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to tell your friends about the show. We'll be back tomorrow morning with our most controversial traffic gripes. You won't want to miss it.